The stories shared in this podcast reflect personal experiences and perspectives. While names and identifying details may be changed, these accounts are told truthfully to the best of our knowledge. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as fact about any specific individual or organisation without independent verification. Our intention is to share experiences, not to cause harm or defame. This podcast deals with themes of emotional abuse, manipulation, and deception. We share these stories not to sensationalize, but to understand how it happens, why it's so hard to see from the inside, and what it takes to break free. Please take care while listening.
I can't forget what you said. It was reckless to use those words. Now I'm stuck on you, and I keep having these dreams where you run away from me, and I know it's not real, but I'm lost on how to feel.
For months, Jess had been living in parallels. But little by little, the symptoms of her relationship with Danni had started to metastasize into her world outside of him, quietly infecting the parts of her life that used to feel safe. She went to work, she smiled, she made space for him, she made plans with him, but her body was keeping score. Danni's moods had become Jess's weather. When he was calm, she could be calm. When he spiraled, she disappeared with him. She'd stopped trusting her own reactions. Somewhere along the way, she stopped trying to prove she wasn't the problem and started trying to be the version of herself that wouldn't set him off. Her expectations had evolved from healthy love and predictability to manageable chaos, and for Jess, that felt like progress. It wasn't getting better, she was just getting used to it. And with Danni, everything that could happen would, over and over and over again. A quick heads up, this episode contains coarse language and covers themes like mental health, emotional abuse, and suicide. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out to Lifeline on 131114 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636, or follow the links in this episode's show notes. Okay, so let's talk about Tom Hardy.
So June and July were just a blur. It was probably the most inconsistently chaotic time. Danni was at a point where I think he felt comfortable in the cycle of chaos and peace. Things were starting to become explosive, and the topics that were exploding were so insanely unfamiliar to me and so unreasonable to me. I just didn't know how we were ever going to get past this.
And Jess, where we left off in the last episode was a pretty intense and immense conversation. What was the aftermath of that?
So following Wayne's intervention, it's like we just kept on towards the next conflict.
I think what I'm still trying to understand is where this rhetoric of you and your hurtful feelings actually came from. It feels like what he wanted you to do was question everything about yourself. Did the Roxy situation even resolve after that?
Actually, it kind of did. It didn't really take long for me to start feeling guilty about this ultimatum that I'd given him. I felt like an absolute shithead. So I told him I didn't really need him to go ahead with cutting her out of his life, or at least I didn't need him to make a decision right then and there. He knew, and it was pretty clear that it still hurt me that she was around. But he decided regardless, Roxy wasn't going to be in his life anymore. And I'll be honest, I just felt this wave of peace and calm come over me hearing that. The pattern was like that though. Something trivial would happen, and somehow it would become me wounding him, and then he would berate me and annihilate my character for literal days, and then suddenly it would end, and it would just feel so good when it finally ended.
So at this stage, you had opened a door that allowed Wayne to see into your dynamic. And you had let your mum in to some of it, but this cycle was still very much one that was happening behind closed doors. And one thing I've thought about a lot is how skilled Danny is at presenting as this effervescent, charming, educated guy. But as we'll come to find out, he wasn't trying very hard at all to conceal his quote unquote secret life beneath all of that. It almost feels in retrospect like the exhibitionist in him was always trying to be discovered, even if he would deny it when it actually was discovered. There's one incident in particular from around the time of the conversation with Wayne that feels like a good example of this. When a friend found Danny somewhere you probably don't want to find your friend's new boyfriend. Do you remember this?
Yeah, that's a really good example of this. So basically, a friend approached me to let me know that she had found Danny on one of the dating apps, and it wasn't actually news to me because Danny had been advertising a room for rent in his home, and he'd been doing it all over the internet and on like paid subscription apps, and they just weren't finding anyone. And so he had told me he had put ads on Bumble and Tinder because it was a really good way of finding flatmates.
Sorry to interrupt, and maybe this is naive of me, but I have literally never heard of someone using a shirtless photo on Bumble and Tinder to find housemates. How had he framed this with you when he told you about it?
I think given everything that was going on, this was one of those very trivial things. And I had seen him creating these ads essentially, and it had been successful for him in the past. I know he had found one of his flatmates on Tinder, I think it was. And so I didn't really question it. I didn't even think it was an issue, to be honest. I thought, oh, fair enough. He doesn't want to pay the subscription for the legit one. So I guess it didn't really cross my mind until that day that someone had found it and brought it up with me. But yeah, I knew when she'd approached me to tell me that she'd found this, I kind of got the feeling she thought I was bullshitting her, as if I was trying to cover his tracks and make an excuse for him. She made a couple of remarks about how strange it was that he was advertising rooms on dating apps, but she also noted in the ad that he was looking for casual fun times. She'd already told me in the past that she was disappointed about my relationship with Danny, and having her confront me about that in this particular moment was just a bit more pressure than I could take because of everything else she didn't know was going on, and it was just way too much. But the thing is, I wasn't aware of these parts of the ad that talked about casual fun times or that he was using images without his shirt on. They were images I had taken of him on that mountain getaway we'd gone to back when the cancer was a thing. And so obviously, she'd put enough doubt in my mind that I had to do some damage control. So I immediately called him and I asked him why he would say things like that in the ads, and he said if it didn't look like a real dating profile, they would delete it, so it had to look somewhat believable. I was feeling like absolute dirt by this point, and I guess I just chose to believe him.
Do you think it's that you chose to believe him or that you chose not to push something that would open those floodgates of chaos again?
I just wanted us to be okay, and I couldn't handle yet another pothole. They were forming into giant fault lines at this point, so it was very delicate. But this sat in my mind and added to the fear, absolutely. The fear of being wrong, of backing a dud horse, of investing so much of my time and emotional bandwidth in this man who just kept presenting to me the absolute worst and best all at once. I also couldn't stand the judgment and punishment from the outside, and I didn't want to be wrong about him anymore. I had brought people into what was happening, and I was at a point where I'd already completely lost myself, and I didn't want to lose him too.
I think that's a really interesting point that you raise of, to quote you, backing a dud horse. What was it that you loved about him?
I've thought about this question a lot, and I know I have feelings of joy and beauty in our relationship. I think the biggest thing that kept me hanging on was the hope of what could be. We could have had a beautiful life together, and I think he knew that dangling that in front of me was keeping me hanging on. There were lots of promises about where we would be after all of these things had resolved and after he'd just gotten past this chaos. And so, I'd made that commitment to support him through cancer, through his mental health. I had accepted conditions that were really harmful to me, and I didn't want to sink those costs, so I held on to the hope.
You've mentioned as well that you're a naturally conflict avoidant person. Do you think you were also starting to panic about conflict outside of your relationship with Danny too?
Yeah, I was definitely avoiding any kind of outside conflict. And I could feel people starting to notice changes in me, and I was trying my best to hide it. I was trying my best to show up and to be myself, but it was getting increasingly harder to do that. Not everyone can understand why I was in that relationship. People handle things differently. And so I felt a lot of pressure externally, whether it was there or not. I felt it. And yeah, it was definitely adding to the piles of conflict that my nervous system was really dreading. When it came to this scenario, when someone's approached me about my boyfriend being on a dating app, I just outwardly laughed it off. I assured her that I knew. There was a moment that I'd said, "You just have to trust me on this one," because I just couldn't explain everything that was going on. So we left it at that.
I think there's something in what you said around people not being able to understand or explain why you were with him. And there might well have been something in you that couldn't explain why you were with him at that point as well. And so that overwhelming knowing that there was something tethering you to this man, but not being able to explain that outwardly and the shame that overlaid that would have been a really complicated thing to navigate for you. But observationally, around this time is when I started to become more and more concerned for your mental health too.
So for people looking in from the outside, I think the challenge in trying to understand why I was there and why I wouldn't just leave and why I wouldn't look after myself is something that I would feel about people as well. I think even in the relationship, could intellectualize what was happening. I could see that it was harming me and that I wasn't in great shape. But at the same time, I really thought I could get past it. And I think having an end goal, having a light at the end of this tunnel really kept me holding on and having to explain that to someone. Why do you have this hope? How are you sure that it's going to be okay one day? I just couldn't find words, or I just couldn't find energy to even try and explain that. By this point, my anxiety was off the charts, and I had reached a point of paranoia, I guess you could call it as well. And not paranoia about him being on dating apps. The paranoia was about me worrying about him constantly, about his well being, about if he was alive. He had threatened suicide to me a few times by this point. He was talking about depression and that he wasn't coping, and so I just wanted to be in contact with him all the time. This apparent dissociation and everything that surrounded it had me on edge, and so I think my checking in on him was probably more than reasonable. The relationship was so volatile as well at this point, and I'd be constantly pushing for more consistency, thinking that would help both of us. And he would then retort with these allegations of me devaluing him or comparing him or him not being good enough for me. And then he started naming me a tyrant. And I couldn't understand where he'd gotten this idea from. But suddenly he had created this split in me. There was this beautiful version of me, but then there was a tyrant that would come out that was controlling and jealous. So we go around this conflict cycle with peace and then conflict and peace and then conflict. And I had been spending a lot of time on my own. We lived so far apart from each other, which just increased my worry. And while I spent a lot of time in my bed by myself, I was always thinking of the worst, thinking of what he might be getting up to, thinking about his mental condition, thinking about who he was spending time with. But also in the peace of this cycle, we did normal relationship things. And that gave me just enough validation to keep holding on.
When you say thinking about what he might be getting up to, what was it that you were worried about? We've spoken a lot about a lot of different things already. Were you worried about the drug usage, that he might be taking drugs? Were you worried about infidelity? Were you worried that he might be more sick than he was letting on still because he was still in remission? Where was your head in that space of worry?
Yeah, can I say all of the above? Because
Yeah.
I was at a point of spiraling. I'd sit there on my own and I'd think about small things he'd said to me or things he'd even accused me of doing and wonder where these ideas had come from. And then I thought maybe he was doing it. I was also terrified about the issue of drugs. I was kind of unsure about the dissociation, and I couldn't imagine, a psychotherapist who has a dissociative disorder would be so casual about using things like ketamine and mushrooms. And so in my head, I was wondering if it was a drug issue. His ex-wife had asked him to get a hair follicle test. Like, it doesn't come out of the blue. And so once again, I'm not an idiot and I can intellectualize things and I can piece things together. And I was in the silence. I was sitting there doing that. And the fault in me, where I went wrong, was probably not confronting him more about it. But at the same time, if I'd even made a suggestion that I was thinking that he was doing the wrong thing, I knew where it would end up. And so I kind of didn't confront him. I just sat on that worry, which probably fired up my nervous system even more.
There's something in the words you just used around the fault in me, what I did wrong. I think we're always trying to find the way that we contributed to a story that didn't end in the way that we wanted it to. But I think it's worth noting that fault doesn't play a role in this. You weren't doing the wrong thing. You weren't doing the right thing. You were just feeling and being. And sometimes the feeling in the body kicks in and overrides everything else. And we're not just talking about a cognizant, logical function, particularly when your nervous system is in such a fragile place and you've been through so much and all you know is what you don't know. So I think there's maybe a little bit of a minute to give yourself pause. There might be a case to not blame yourself quite as much as it sounds like you are in this. Sometimes it's very hard to understand what you don't understand.
That's a really good point. I think I'm at a place now where I can look back and say I was very still in this relationship. I always felt like I was very still in that I didn't want to break anything. And I looked back on that as a way of comparing us and trying to see where things went wrong. And that was always what I had thought. I was really still. I was really silent. I didn't move. I didn't do anything. I barely saw my friends at this point. So it felt like I was with Danny. I was trying to calm Danny down, or I was lying in my bed worrying about what Danny was getting up to. That's what our relationship felt like. So in these moments of silence, there was also a part of me, because I was worried about him, and the best way for me not to be was to either be with him or have contact with him. And so I could really feel this cycle starting to form of me. They say any publicity is good publicity. Any contact with Danny was good contact with Danny because at least I knew what he was doing at any point in time. And so I think there was a part of me that accepting peace was one thing, but then I had been caught in this cycle of peace and chaos. And so I was expecting chaos. I knew I could do things and cause the chaos. And so I think on occasion I may have even done that, if I'm being completely honest. I think maybe I said things to him to get him to respond. And they weren't unreasonable things. I don't want people to think I was saying these crazy, outright accusatory things, but I was certainly reaching out and asking him more questions than I would than usual. And then I knew I'd have his attention. And then I could stop worrying. But then came the chaos. And so it was just this impossible cycle of sitting in peace, falling into a silence of terror of what's coming next or what is he doing, reaching out and poking the bear, and then, oh no, what have I done? Here comes the chaos. It was like an addiction for me.
That's a really interesting point because it feels a lot like and let's not forget what he does for a living. And I do think he's probably very good at it. I don't know you to be a controlling person at all. That's not a personality trait that I would apply to you or reflect on in you. But your use of words like controlling, understanding, where he was and what he was doing, it feels a little bit like you were leaning into the things that he was telling you were. Here is this person who is very good at pulling out the most vulnerable aspects of you or anybody, telling you you are controlling, you are a tyrant, you are chaos, and helping you to lean into those patterns.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, when I say, I knew what to say to sort of poke the Danny bear, I wasn't saying ridiculous things. It could be as simple as asking him where he was and what he was doing at a particular point in time. which in a relationship that had been as intense and as connected as ours was, that's a completely reasonable question. But that's something that would set him off. And so I started to believe that even asking those very small questions, inquiring about his location at any point in time, and not even accusing him of being somewhere where he shouldn't be, it just felt like if I was to take up any space in his life that he wasn't offering me, I was doing the wrong thing. I was stepping outside of the territory that I had been allotted. I learned to live in pretty strict borders in this relationship, and if I stepped my toe outside of them, I knew what would happen as a result.
For every wave of peace, Jess found herself bracing for the conflict that would inevitably follow. With the cycle becoming increasingly more erratic and volatile, the desperation for some glimmer of the man she was in love with grew.
Not long into June, we made a date to have dinner at his childhood friend's home. Danny had engaged a therapist at this point, and I was just relieved to be in what felt like somewhat of a normal loving relationship for a few days at least. This was the first friend of his I was going to meet, and when we did meet, he and his wife were just beautiful people. It was so normal and so happy, and I felt so secure in that moment. It was like all the things I knew about Danny were validated in that one dinner. They seemed to adore him just as much and in all the ways that I did. And they had known him his whole life. So how could I be wrong?
And that would have felt really reassuring that the man you felt was in him and were trying so hard to love was actually there. So, as you mentioned, he'd engaged a therapist at this point. Did you feel like that was helping?
He had been seeing this therapist for a few weeks. Helping is a strong word. He had expressed more fear about being honest with her about what was going on. She knew what his job was, so if he was too honest, she would be obliged to report him. Whilst he was going and working through the things with her, I don't know if it was as sincere as it could have been. He eventually asked me to come and join him, not in a couples therapy sense, but to sit with him and support him through those conversations. I did. I started going along. At first, I would be quiet, I would sit and listen, and I would just be there to be a safe presence. But as the sessions continued, it was sort of, let's reflect on your experience of Danny's dissociative moments. That was a really terrifying position for me to be put in because there were some really terrifying moments to reflect on. And I didn't want to say anything in those sessions that would expose him or paint him in a bad light. And so I was trying to be honest for the sake of a good therapeutic outcome. But at the same time, I didn't want to hang up those video calls and then have to face the consequences of what I'd said.
And that's multifaceted, right? Because you knew how nervous he was about overexposing and potentially losing his license, but you also knew he definitely needed to be in therapy and working through this, but you didn't want to be the cause of the end of his career. That's a really complicated place to be at this point.
Yeah, and at times it felt like a bit of a trap. He would say to me beforehand, you can be honest, you can talk about your experience of my dissociation. But at the same time, I do recall there had been times where I'd said things and he sort of refuted what I'd said. So it felt like I'd done the wrong thing.
And how did the therapist respond to those statements from him?
I think she was doing her best. He would go in and out of dissociation in these sessions, not in a rageful, violent way, but he certainly would become vulnerable. And she was focused on maintaining his focus in those sessions. So I'm not a specialist in dissociative identity disorder, so I don't know what a therapist would do to treat that. But there would be moments where he'd be reflecting on childhood or people in his life, and then he would dissociate. And not in the way that a lot of us dissociate in situations of high stress, where you sort of lose focus or you go elsewhere. And she would do things to bring him back and remind him that he was in the room with us and that he was safe and that he was with me and his therapist. And so they were really quite surreal experiences for me. And she wasn't based in the same place that we were. So they were all over video call. And sometimes I was doing them from my office at work. And so I'd be sitting in these meeting rooms at work and It was just a lot. It was a lot of confronting grow up Jessica moments.
Yeah, a lot is, well, let's be honest, that feels like you are minimizing what this felt like at the time. You mentioned in an earlier conversation that there had been some concern over how he would select the right therapist to support him through this journey, and that you had looked at a number of different people, some offshore, to make sure that it wouldn't threaten his license. How did you land on this particular therapist?
I didn't land on this therapist, he did. So I'm not sure how he'd found her, but I do remember he had told me she was a specialist in dissociative disorders. I'm not sure that's entirely true, if I'm being honest.
So you mentioned that eventually she did bring you into the sessions. How did that come about?
So I think we were maybe 2 or 3 deep with my attendance in these sessions, and the conversations had turned to it was about how I was triggering him, and it would be about the things that I would do that would trigger him. And so one of the issues he'd brought up is that I would hurt him with references to big dicks. And so immediately, I don't wanna say am filled with shame, but I think I was just filled with shame in front of another person who could hear him accusing me of these things that I still couldn't understand.
Jess, I mean, how many times were you talking about big dicks?
Well, according to Danny, it was something that I spoke about regularly. I have thought about this so much, and searching back over every conversation and any moment that I possibly could have mentioned the size of a penis, I think, no, I'm certain it was one joke, one time. And I think that was a result of me trying to deflect from a very awkward moment between us. For it to keep coming around and for it to present itself in a therapy session about his dissociative identity disorder was just a lot for me to swallow. And I didn't know how to respond to the therapist who was asking me questions about why I insisted on saying the thing that was hurting and triggering Danny.
I actually don't even know what to really say. The image of you sat in a meeting room in your office having this kind of conversation, it's just really fucked.
Yes, it was really fucked. I can't explain how these situations ended up where they were with a straight face because it seemed so ridiculous. And it wasn't like I would make a joke about a big dick and then suddenly he would be triggered. It was that I would do it. I did it once, come on. And he would then bring it into conversation. And then that conversation would spiral because I would try and defend myself. And then the very thought of me defending myself or trying to explain myself or try to even tell him that I didn't have intention to offend him or to hurt him with those comments, that was an offense in itself. It was like this cycle of, Jessica, you can't repair with me if you won't accept that you've hurt me. And so in these sessions, it became very much about my behaviors triggering Danny. And I think for the therapist, and look, I don't know what her intention was, and I don't know what her experience is, but the only thing that I can land on is that I was an easier target for her than he was. You know, when I think back to the sessions watching him, in my memory, he looks like he's performing. And so if you're a therapist, you're gonna know if someone's performing. And so I think for her, rather than dealing with his performance, she thought she'd lean on me and start asking me questions and start digging away at who I was and what my problem was, because I was the trigger for Denny after all. There are a few things that stand out about these sessions. One was this moment where Danny had been talking about he feels like he doesn't belong with me because he doesn't fit my prototype of what a male's physicality should be. And so she was trying to convince him that, Jessica is supporting you. And he would agree. He'd say, yeah, it's really foreign for me to have someone offering me so much support, but she's also causing me so much hurt. And so I remember this therapist saying, Danny, you belong with Jessie. And that was really jarring for me at that point. It seemed like a really bold thing for a therapist to say in that situation. And it's not like I was hoping she would notice that there was this abusive dynamic between us, but I kind of was hoping she would notice there was an abusive dynamic between us. He was there to get help, and I thought she could help him with that. It was, yeah, that statement was a lot. That same day, in that very same session, as I'm sat in this meeting room looking out at our office, she then says to me, "Jessie, do you have any trauma in your life?" And I just sunk. There was something in me that just sunk into my chair, and I realized what was happening. I realized that he'd built this dynamic with his therapist where I was now the enemy, and I felt like I was gonna be attacked by both of them. Despite attending these sessions with this psychologist, I was reaching a point of complete desperation. I was still showing up to work, but it felt like my body was falling apart. Like I couldn't conceal this anymore. You could see it in my face. I could see it in my face. I was still going to work though. I was still showing up in my life, but the abuse was just getting louder and it was becoming more constant. I think I had thought that if I still brought him into my world, fought more for that predictability and that routine and that normal relationship integration, things would get better. So I set up a time for us to have dinner with my dear friend Mel.
The next person in Jess's life you're going to meet is Mel. Vivacious, bright, and the ultimate hype woman, Jess and Mel have been friends for so long, their relationship is more like siblings. I asked Mel to share her memories of meeting Danni for the first time. How do you and Mel know each other?
Well, fortunately for Mel, I was brought into the same classroom as Mel in grade 1, and she just saw potential and wanted to be in on it. Mel went overseas for a long period of time. She went to live in England and Spain with her family, and we were all on the oval. I think it was grade 4. Grade 4.
Yeah, I came.
All the kids were on the oval, and all of a sudden, everyone turns and just starts screaming and running towards this girl. And I didn't really recall who she was. So, we did start school together, and I joined, and we were all like, Mel! And I was like, yeah! And so then we ended up in the same class, and then we became really good friends.
Yeah, that was really when the relationship was properly cemented. And I essentially became the 8th sibling in Jessie's household. So pretty much most of our adolescent life, I did travel a lot with my mother being Spanish. I used to go overseas quite a lot, but the one consistent friend I've ever had in my whole life has been Jess. She's been my one person that has known me through everything, knows everything about me, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful, and vice versa. So Jess is the sun, and I'm just really glad that I've been pulled into her orbit.
Oh, wow. So it's safe to say you've been friends for what, nearly 30 years?
Yeah, longer than that.
So you feel confident that you know Jess pretty well?
Jess is one of those few people that I have in my life that I don't have to qualify anything. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to say, oh, but you know what I really mean, and vice versa. Jess has been with me through some of my happiest moments in my life and through the absolute darkest moments in my life. She is one of the reasons why I'm still here today, walking this earth. And I think that can also be said by her as well. So we have a beautiful friendship, but like any good friendship, it gets tested and it goes through trials and tribulations, ebbs and flows.
So you would have heard in the first interview we did with Wayne, I asked Wayne to use 3 words to describe Jess. So Mel, what are 3 words that you would use to describe Jess?
Gravity, genuine, and hilarious.
Jess, 3 words for Mel.
Mel is inquisitive. Mel is loyal to me only, nobody else, and deceptively insightful.
Well, that's 4 words, but they are beautiful words. So Mel, we've talked a lot about who Jess is and her relationship style. And what do you know about Jess when she's in a relationship? Have you been part of much of her romantic history, knowing her as long as you have? I would imagine that you had been there for some of the highlights and the lowlights and the no lights. How would you explain who Jess is as a partner, observationally?
I mean, I guess how far do you want me to go back? Are we talking grade 1 relationships? No. Jess is actually, funny enough, is one of the few people in my life that's had many relationships. You can pretty much count them on one hand. And I just think that she, for a long time, liked the idea of a relationship rather than having to actually do one. She did have one relationship that I remember quite well. Actually, I remember a couple of them on overseas, but the one I'm thinking of at the moment was when we were both living together. And that was, I think, one of her first big loves. It really did teach her a lot about what it was like to have to share someone else's space. But the time between that relationship and the relationship that we're talking about now, I would almost say it was like 10, 15 years. So in that time, I've been married, divorced, and got married again. So we kind of, her and I moved at different speeds, and that's not right or wrong. It just is. So when Danni came into her life, I was thrilled by it because for a long time she said to me, "Oh, I don't need anyone. I don't need anything. I've got everything I need. I'm happy. Got my friends. I got my dogs. I'm good." And even though I believed her, I never truly believed her. I think we all crave companionship. There's nothing wrong with that. And when Danni came into her life, I was really happy for her because I was like, finally, there's someone in her life that can help enrich it further. And that's what I saw that relationship to begin with.
So what did you know about Danni and about Jess and Danni's relationship before you met him?
To be honest, not that much. You know, I think it was about nearly 6 months from when she told me she'd met someone and she was going on dates with this person and things seemed to be really good. You know, the normal relationship things you would hear. She occasionally would reach out for some insights and advice. How do you manage conflict in a relationship? And I think that was really kind of natural because two people, when they get together, it's learning how do you mesh your life in with someone else's. And that was always like the challenge. And so up until that point, I'd really thought, oh, you know, it's just things were good. You know, I did eventually message her. I was like, you know, when do I get to meet this guy? I got really excited because once again, Jess hadn't committed to anyone. She'd seen people, she had dated people, but she hadn't actually been in a relationship. And I wanted to meet this person that she finally committed to. Like, who is this guy? What's about him that managed to catch her attention? Because she is a gem. To get her attention, this guy must be amazing.
Absolutely. And I think there's a beautiful thing that you said about, you know, you had one of those friendships that didn't mean that you were checking in constantly because you've been friends for so long that those natural ebbs and flows in how consistent and constantly you are communicating. So were you aware that Danni was unwell?
Yeah, I was. At the time, I was actually working in a hospital environment for a charity. And I remember getting a call from Jess, and she was quite distraught and aptly so. I mean, to hear that someone that you've just started dating have this cancer diagnosis. And I remember her being in tears. And I actually think I cried because I was thinking, far out. She's finally found someone and he's dying. And then my concern was like, that is such a big weight to have at the beginning of a relationship. And how is she going to emotionally manage it? And I know Jess cares and she cares deeply. And when you are in her inner circle, she will move heaven and earth to help you. And I started to worry instinctively, just going, I hope she doesn't give too much of herself in trying to help him so early in the relationship for a poor return. But then I was like, oh, that also sounds terrible because this poor man's dying. Does he not deserve to have love? And that whole internal conflict happened. And I was just like, I just need to be there for Jess and help her however she needs. It's not my place to tell her what she should and shouldn't do. That's for her. She's a big girl. She can make up her own mind whether she wants to be in this relationship or not. So what can I do to help to support her? And she would occasionally message and tell me how things were going. And yeah, it was interesting because there was the cancer and then there wasn't. So.
And I think before there would have been questions for any of us about the legitimacy of the cancer, there would have also been a lot of relief for you. You know, I reflect on what you were saying before about how rare it was for Jess to be in a relationship like this and this needing to be a special kind of person to be someone Jess would be ready to commit to and to go through that experience and to know he was so unwell. And then obviously you would have felt some relief in knowing that he was in remission and that this was something real.
Yeah. To be honest, I actually don't even really remember when he went into remission. I can't remember that part.
You just knew that he was.
No, it's like that part of the story disappeared. At one point, it was such a defining feature of their relationship, and then it wasn't.
So you reached out to Jess and said, when am I going to get to meet this man? And obviously that was something that you were really excited to do. Just given everything that you were going through, which you had obviously not spoken too much to anybody about at this point, when Mel reached out and said, hey, when am I going to get to meet this guy? What was your reaction to that? Talk to me a little bit about what you remember about setting up that first meeting with Mel.
I remember Mel and I had some time apart. Mel was going through a lot herself, and so we hadn't been in each other's pockets for a while. I remember we went and had a coffee, and I was excited to be telling Mel all about Danny. But at the same time, I wanted to share some things with her about his mental health. And I had been talking to her, not necessarily seeking her counsel, but I wanted to bounce it off her. I think I minimized a lot of what was happening. And so Mel listened, and she let me know about struggles she'd had in her relationship, and I tried to hang on to the similarities, and I was like, oh, okay, this is normal. This is things that everyone goes through. But I also remember her being excited for me. Mel has always wanted me to meet someone because she believes that I deserve love in my life, and that had been a constant push and pull between us, of Mel being like, yeah, but it's so nice. You should try it. And so I was excited to tell her about him. And she was excited that I'd found that. And so naturally, I wanted them to meet. And Mel is a super personable human being. And I thought that Danni would love her. I was very excited for them to meet. Although I wanted it to happen quickly, I don't think it happened until a lot longer after that because of all of the things that were happening in our life. So, we got there eventually.
There would have been almost a peace, I would imagine, for you as well, in being able to have this person who knew you so well and be having what felt like a pretty normal conversation about the excitement of it, because again, you had spent so much time in the challenge of it, and you were starting to bring people in different ways. And here's Mel, who is lightness and levity, and having a conversation about love and a conversation about how exciting it was to find that love. And that, I would imagine, felt quite encouraging and easy. And, there would have been a lot of excitement in that for you.
Mel knows me from a very young age. She knows exactly the environment I grew up in. She knows the joy. She knows the struggles. And I think she also can see my bullshit in most ways. And so, I was happy on my own. I'm not backing down on that. I was a happy, independent woman, and I was genuinely so fulfilled by all my friendships. But I think there was a little bit of that, like, look at what I've done, Mel. I did the thing, and I'm actually enjoying it. And you were right. Are you proud of me?
So you set up a dinner. It was a dinner that you had?
Yeah, it was a dinner at one of our favorite Italian little restaurants.
And so that dinner was you and Danni, obviously, Jess, and
Yeah, it was me and my husband.
cute. So it was like a little double date
I
as
know.
well.
It finally happened.
Which was a little bit daunting, I'm going to say out loud, because there was going to be a real clash of worlds at that table as well. And so I knew Mel would be fine. I knew Mel would fit in and be the person that needed to be at that table. I was worried about her husband, who might be a little bit more uncomfortable with who Danni was.
Which is ironic because, in a way, Danni and I are quite similar. We're both very loud and talkative. We both speak multiple languages. We have, different upbringings to the average.
Or at least around that table, because me and your husband are probably more similar in that respect.
I think it's just funny, isn't it, that my partner is the male version of Jess, and Jess's partner is the the male
On
version
a
of
very
me.
superficial level.
So Mel, we might just start with you recollecting the first parts of that dinner. Take us to the first meeting of Danni.
Well, he wasn't there, to be honest. My first memory was sitting at the dinner table with Jess and my husband, and Jess was apologetic. She was saying, Danny's just on the phone to his family. We're here. Actually, no, you arrived late already to begin with. Wasn't too bad. It was like 15 minutes. That's within the acceptable window of being late, I feel. Jess came down, she sat with us at the table, and she's like, sorry, he's on the phone, he'll be with us momentarily. Moments turned into longer moments, and it came a point in time, I think maybe 30 minutes later, we just made the decision to order food. We started eating because he still wasn't there. And then maybe 45 minutes, an hour later, he arrived, and he just came in like a cyclone. It was this frantic energy and this loud, vivacious smile on his face. And the way he looked at Jess, the way that he embraced her and kissed her like she was the center of his universe, I couldn't help but feel endeared towards him because that's how I see Jess. So to see, even though he was late and that annoyed me, I'm like, no. It's your first time meeting. He mostly has a really good reason. Don't judge. Just be enthusiastic. And he's enthusiastic to Jess, so why wouldn't I be enthusiastic towards him? So he comes in. I can't even really remember what he said, to be perfectly honest. But at some point in time, after introductions were had, we sat down and we started talking. And somehow the conversation turned into him talking about jerking off other men in circles and about private school boys, and it was all very weird. I thought personally, I was like, oh, he's just trying to cut the tension, or perhaps he's just trying to make really bad jokes that aren't landing. And maybe he's trying to, like, he's a bit intimidated by my husband because my husband's 6 foot. You know, he's kind of like the perfect man. And maybe he's feeling a little bit intimidated by him. I don't know. It was interesting.
What was Jess's energy like through this? Firstly, what was Jess's energy like when he wasn't there?
Mhm.
And then through these very bizarre conversations?
Jess was nervous. I think she legitimately felt frustrated and apologetic that we'd made this booking. We'd organised it in advance, and yet she was late. And not only she's late, he's still not here. And the whole point of this get-together was to meet him. So Jess was understandably nervous and looking frustrated, but I was trying to, like, it's okay, don't worry, like, it's fine, don't worry about it, it's fine, you know, we'll be okay. And then when he came in and was this mass of energy, I don't know, Jess, I couldn't actually see her response because he had this way of being the center of attention and pulling focus. That was Danni. And I was also a little bit worried about how my husband was feeling. And the way that we were seated, I was kind of across from my husband and I was kind of looking at him. And also I was here to meet Danni. So I was kind of also focused a bit more on him. So I could tell Jess was agitated beforehand, but then afterwards, once we kind of parted, she seemed a little bit less annoyed, but I could still tell she wasn't happy. But relieved that it was maybe over, I think is a good, she's nodding. I think that is a good description.
So Jess, how did you feel when he starts talking about masturbation and circle jerks with private school boys?
I think I was prepared for it to happen. I knew what he was doing. That was his way of disarming and taking control, to throw people right off. And that had been a theme with people he'd met. He had done it often in my circles. I can't imagine him doing that with his friends. I can't imagine his response if I did it with his friends. But Mel's right. I was nervous about the meeting. I was nervous that he was late. We arrived together. Why wasn't he at the table with me? And I knew why. He was on a phone call with all of his family overseas, and it was an important call, but it was a scheduled call as well. So it seemed odd that it was scheduled for that time. I also don't like public displays of affection, and he knew that, and he made a point to pull me into those, and he did that when he arrived at the table.
Did you notice that, Mel?
Yeah, well, that's what I said. It's funny though, isn't it? Even though I know Jess, there was something that I was like, oh, he really loves her because, you know, he's fawning over her. He's being, in hindsight, over the top. But in the moment, I don't know, I always find excuses for people. So I was just like, oh no, he's just, and maybe he was feeling guilty because he was running so late. So he was really just huggy, feely, kissy, really intense.
And by this point for me, it was Danni controlled the environment for me as well as anyone around him that he could. So I think by that time I had learned that I would take relief where I could get it. He'd arrived. Thank God he's here. And then you're right, Mel, when the dinner ended, it was relief because, okay, we've done that thing. It's over now. which is kind of a bit shitty now thinking about it. These moments are meant to be beautiful connections with people in our lives, and it turned it into this real clinical thing for me. We just had to get that over with. He just had to meet my people, and then we've ticked that box, and that's what it kind of felt like, which is shit. I hate that that's what it turned into. There was also, because Mel did show up the way she does, I was also relieved because Mel had received what he'd given and she took it, and she doesn't take offense easily either. So I think, like Mel says, trying to give people the benefit of the doubt, and she did. And so that was also a relief. And
I mean, it's always hard getting a sense of who anyone is in the first time you meet someone because people are quite performative and they want to be perceived in a certain light. But he was laughing, he was smiling. So his choice of words were interesting and the topics of conversation was interesting. I put it down to nerves. I put it down to knowing that I'm the one person in Jess's life that's known her the longest. He most probably understood how important this was. I put it down to nerves and put it down to wanting to make a good impression but failing miserably. But I was like, I'm not going to judge him on that because look at the way he looked at her. And she obviously loves him or was falling in love with him. So why would I think anything more than what I was just seeing? And maybe in the next interactions, I'll get a more tempered version and I'll get to actually know who he is versus just someone who's talking about a circle jerk.
I mean, you can never judge someone on their first conversation of a circle jerk.
I mean, it's such a normal topic of conversation, really, isn't it?
Did you like him after that first meeting?
I did. And I think I even texted Jess saying, I really like him. I can see why you're together. I'm glad that, you found someone that's making you happy. And I look forward to like many more get-togethers or something to that effect. And then surprisingly, I was very surprised. I received a text message back, but it wasn't from Jess. It was from her phone, but it was from Danni. And it was a very long message, basically to summarize how lucky Jess is to have such amazing people in her life and that he hopes that he can bring the same love and energy to this relationship as I've brought to her life. And yeah, it was long and it was very sweet. And I was like, oh, what guy does that? No one ever, I don't know of any guy I've ever met of my girlfriend or boyfriends that have partners texted me to go, you are all these amazing things. So I was like, oh, wow, okay, cool. All right, thank you.
So sweet.
Excited thumbs up.
So Mel, I'm really curious. You mentioned that you were mindful of how your husband might be perceiving the topics of conversation. How was Danni interacting with your husband?
Oh, it was strange. And you have to understand, my husband, he's quite stoic. He's a man of few words. He holds himself really well and his presence, but he's not one to speak unless there's a reason to. And Danni is like the complete opposite. So I don't know if he was trying to say these things to try to get my husband to react, or once again, it was just really bad jokes. I mean, my husband was quite sweet. He did laugh along and tried to like ease the tension. It's not like he was stone cold faced and like stopping it, because he knew how important it was for me and for Jess for this to work. But I think what's really interesting was once we had left this get together, we were back in the car and I turned to him and I said, so what do you think? And he looked at me and went, there's something not right with that guy. And I was like, really? In what way? He's like, yeah, no. I was like, oh, I thought he was fine. And he was like, Jess can do better.
Well, she can.
Well, we all know that now.
She can.
I mean, we always knew it.
It was an interesting feeling of being safe at a table with someone that I have known my whole life and who I know knows me very well. And then having someone come in who had played a very loud role in my life, joining us. And I loved him. I deeply loved him. And that affection that you talk of, I can say from my point of view, that affection was real. There shouldn't be nervousness in that situation. If that's the truth, if I'm with someone who I trust and love and who knows me so well, and then I'm with this new person who I love deeply, you shouldn't feel nervous. But I felt very nervous about it. The lateness really threw me off. And I did feel embarrassed by that because I had been waxing lyrical about this man in my life, and his first impression is to show such little care that he walks in an hour late. But relief probably took over when he did arrive, and then we were getting close. I think by the time he walked in, the kitchen had shut, and that's why we had to order food. We had to order because they were going to close the kitchen, and so probably like a race to the end. I knew it was going to be over soon. So it was nice that he was meeting Mel, but at the same time, it wasn't what I would have hoped that meeting to be.
Do you think it's weird that he was not a little bit late, very late to every meeting of people in your life?
There's some interesting themes in meeting people in my life. One, lateness. Yes, he was late to meeting you. He was late to meeting Wayne. And now he was late to meeting Mel. He also used sexually suggestive language to Wayne. He also used sexually suggestive language to you. And now he was really using sexually suggestive language in this meeting as well. So yeah, I did notice some themes later on. At the time I was in the world around me was crumbling. I was barely holding on in some ways. And so I didn't notice it at the time, but yeah, there definitely are some themes.
The sexual language is really interesting. Did he talk like that with you normally?
No, and in fact, he would often bring up, as I've said, that I would talk that way. So it was quite a contrast to his expectation of me versus how he presented.
Much later in it, there was a very particular moment where Danni was essentially saying that Jess had used all of her best bits for people before her and was recreating herself as this saintly human who refused him any kind of indulgences. Jess is a grown woman who has had a big life, and everything that goes with that, is that something that you could imagine that she would do, is to just create a situation of piety to torture him?
Let me be clear. No. An emphatic no. There's nothing in Jess's life that you would say is any different to any average person. I would say that Jess drinks a healthy amount. If anything, she drinks. I don't consider myself a big drinker, but I still think that I now drink more than she does. Like, I'll say to Jess, let's catch up for a wine, and she'll drive in and not have a wine. And that's not because she's better than me. That's not because she's trying to prove some type of point of moral positioning to say, look at me, I'm holier than thou. No. It's just, we all go through stages in our lives where we drink, we don't drink. We have partners, we're sexual, we're not. We go abstinent for a year or 6 months or 3 months. But to really bring it back to Jess, no, Jess, if anything, is more just normal.
She's just like
everyone
herself
else.
with everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, she's just like everyone else. She's just normal. There is nothing, unique in that regard.
I can imagine that meeting with Mel would have felt pretty great, or at least it would have been a huge relief because, here is someone reflecting back at you that this is a great guy who obviously loves you, and you would have been seeking that kind of validation at point. But that's a really weird meeting by the sounds of it. How did you show up in that kind of joy when everything else was so volatile, and make sense of the absurdity of that kind of meeting?
We have to remember at this point in time, this had become cyclical, right? I had fallen into this role. I think my brain had recalibrated even to go, okay, this is the environment I'm living in. We have these moments. He loves me deeply. He publicly loves me deeply. He's telling people how much he loves me. But in the next moment, he can be very much not showing me that he loved me. That became the new normal for me. It was like I was the Robin in his Batman story. Well, not even the Robin, probably more the Alfred in his Batman story. I felt like it was my role to be the silent cleaner in the background for whatever was going on for him. And I really started to take responsibility for that role. And, some of the things I started to try and do to sort of build some control and consistency, whilst it wasn't the consistency or the predictability that I wanted, I started to be able to predict what was happening, and there was comfort in that. I know that sounds really abstract, and I know it sounds really strange, but that was the normal now for me. That was what I could hold on to as knowing to be true.
I don't think it sounds strange because what you were seeking was some kind of semblance of a routine, right? Where most people would find predictability in, I'll come to yours and we'll have dinner or we'll go on a date night. You were finding the cycle of conflict predictable. So it's just the worst kind of answer to the question you'd been asking.
Just when I thought I'd caught up with some kind of predictability or control over what was happening, something new would present itself and I'd have a whole nother bucket load of worry built in. I recall this one instance, which is just a really small example, but an example of things that started to spark concern in my head about a whole new issue. And we were texting one day, and I think I had been quite worried about his well-being and doing my, like, overprotective checking in on him, making sure he's okay. In those moments, sometimes he was quite consoling and he would understand and he knew why I was so worried, when he was playing into the, "Oh, I've got dissociative disorder, that must be terrifying for you." But he, in an attempt to ease my concerns, he'd sent me this picture, and this was in the nighttime, we were both going to bed, but this picture was of him half naked in the daytime from a random hotel room that I didn't recognize. And so I asked him, "What'd you take that picture for?" It immediately set off alarm bells in me going, "Where on earth was this taken?" And I knew it was recent because he, in the picture, was wearing necklaces that he'd recently purchased. And so I asked him what he took it for. And I was trying to understand why he was taking these sexy pictures of himself in the middle of the day in a random hotel room when I understood he was working 9 to 5. And he immediately got mad at me for questioning it. I knew where that was going, and I just wasn't in a place for where it was headed that night. So I very quickly apologized. I remember writing to him, "Immediate white flag. Surrender, surrender. I'm so sorry. I wasn't trying to suggest anything by it." But it was too late. I was going to destroy our relationship unless I got help, apparently. That made me pathological. He called me abusive. He said it was jealousy. He said I was coercively controlling him and it was an invasion of his privacy. And he then spiraled into this. I, I, I don't even know how to explain it. He literally gave me a legal warning.
A legal warning? What do you mean? Did he serve you?
I mean, he literally provided me with a threat of legal action. I still have the messages. Would you like to read them out?
Would you like me to read them out?
Sure.
Jessie, as I stated to you over the phone, I am speaking to psychologists. I've spoken to my family, I've spoken to my friends, and there is a near unanimous agreement that the only way to deal with this is to involve the law. As such, I am here now giving you my warning, Jessie. As I told you over the phone, I love you very much. That doesn't mean that you can abuse me. I am, by my own rights, a citizen of the world, and by my own rights, deserve to not be abused. Australian law protects me from abuse. Wherever and whoever that abuse comes from should fear law. I hope and pray that from tomorrow, you do not need to fear the law at all because you will not engage in any abusive behaviour towards me. No violence, no excessive control, no coercion. So this is the only threat you will hear from me, and I expect nothing else and nothing less from you. I am threatening you with Australian law should you allow yourself to act on your urges that are violent, controlling, and hostile towards me. If you do not act on those urges, if they do not result in behaviour that harms me, then you have nothing to worry about. I have nothing to worry about because I know I'm not going to do those things ever. And if I ever do, well, I'll get in trouble with the law. It's as simple as that. That's all I have to say. Good night. I hope that tomorrow we can have a fresh start, a relationship that operates with law in mind. That message is a lot, and I think that we might actually need to post that on our socials because it is very hard to fathom everything that has just been said in that message.
I'm no lawyer, Keeks, but I didn't know that asking your boyfriend why he'd taken a sexy picture of himself during the day would result in threats of litigation. I don't even think that's litigation. I think it's like threatening me with criminal action, It was a mindfuck. And I hope that this demonstrates to people the absolute absurdity of the chaos that would exist. That question was so small. I feel like most people would ask their partners the same question, and I could be wrong, but I feel like it's probably quite typical. But, we would have these moments and then it would just explode into this ridiculousness, and it's so irrational. And then you need to contrast that with the moments of these super endearing, super complimentary messages, like the one he sent to Mel, and it just would flip. And I started to feel like I was absolutely losing my mind.
It feels like he was trying to ensure that you were constantly deregulated. Like if he kept you in this constant state of fight or flight, that he could just maintain the power dynamic.
At this point, my brain was working overtime. I was processing everything that had gone on right from the beginning: the cancer, the dissociation, the abuse, the cycle that we had fallen into. My anxiety was through the roof, and looking back on it now, I feel like I was in this constant state of needing to prove to him that I wasn't the things he was saying I was. When someone threatens you with legal action, like, there's a part of you that panics, doesn't matter how ridiculous it may seem. Like, you start to panic going, "Wait, do I need to have handcuffs on? Do you need to go and speak to a judge about my behavior?" And so anytime I got reassurance from him that we were okay, it felt like it was a drug, to be honest. And he was also using his therapist as a weapon at this point. So I was getting this feedback that, she saw you. She knows who you are and what you're doing. There was one night around this time where we'd had another evening in a hotel because we were spending a lot of time in hotels, and it was fun. We talked and we laughed, and he let me do his makeup, and it was super light and playful. Just a completely non-serious moment with my boyfriend. And we had to pop outside to move our cars from the street. And while we were waiting outside in the lobby to go back upstairs, he asked me something just completely random out of the blue. He said, "Would you ever sleep with Tom Hardy?" And honestly, to this day, I have no idea where that question came from, but I will regret my answer for eternity. I responded honestly, and I said, "Oh, 100% yes." And it was left at that. We went back up and continued our night, and then we had a bath together, and boom, he dissociated again.
Because of Tom Hardy?
It wasn't apparent at the time that it was because of Tom Hardy. He started calling me by a male's name, like some childhood friend of his. And I again had to support him through a few hours of this episode. And it wasn't violent and it wasn't abusive, but it was still terrifying. He was completely elsewhere. And I just sat there with him, naked in the bath, trying to remind him where he was and who I was. I had watched his therapist do it, so I was trying to do the same thing. "You're here, you're safe, I'm with you, Danny." He eventually snapped out of it, and then we continued our night as if it was just something we had to deal with together, and I tried to be as safe as possible for him.
Wait, can we just go back to Tom Hardy for a quick second? Because I remember one day you turned to me at our desk and just randomly, completely out of the blue, said to me, "Would you fuck Tom Hardy?" And obviously, the answer to that is, "Oh, yeah, 100% I would." I don't think anyone on the planet could truthfully answer no to that question.
I cannot tell you where Tom Hardy came from. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's England, but in that instance, I don't know where it came from. But it started a narrative that would continue throughout our relationship of him not being my type because Tom Hardy was my ideal type. And it just kept spiraling. At this point, I was losing it completely. It was like my body was falling apart. I was still trying to live my life and show up and do the things that I needed to do. But the abuse was just getting louder. It was getting more constant, and it was getting more ridiculous. I mean, Tom Hardy was the problem now.
I mean, there's something in the natural progression of cancer, psychological condition, Tom Hardy. These are real relationship challenges to get over, right? But in all seriousness, did he go back to the conversation of Tom Hardy in the dissociation at that point in the bath? Or was it just a pocketed reaction for later?
Tom Hardy didn't come up again. That whole episode in the bath was something completely different. It was like a complete regression to childhood for him. And I couldn't tell you to this day what was going on and what he was talking about. I just recall he kept referring to a childhood friend of his.
Named Tom Hardy.
Uh, I wish.
So what's becoming really apparent is that Danny seemed to trick you into saying something that he could then use to ambush you with as many awful words as he possibly could.
Absolutely. Constantly. Into all hours of the night. So Tom Hardy would come up because the reason why Tom Hardy was a problem was because apparently he was the antithesis to what Danny was. And so, you know, I would 100% sleep with Tom Hardy turned into Tom Hardy is 100% my type because he is a white male with tattoos. These were things that I could never explain my way out of because just there was no logic behind it. And so when these arguments would come up, it would give him material to go on forever about it. And these arguments would go on and they would go on, and I was running on zero sleep.
So you've shared with me some of these messages as we've been having this conversation, and some of the things he said to you are so vile. I mean, I wouldn't say these things to someone I hated.
A part of the process of doing this podcast has been reflecting on the text history that we have. And, a lot of these arguments would happen via text, which has been a blessing because I can reflect on it. But at the same time, I see some of these things he would say to me. And whilst they're shocking, what's most shocking to me is how I was responding. I would be talking to him about how we can improve our relationship really gently, saying things like, maybe we just need a routine or maybe we just need some more predictability. And he would just say the most vile thing to me. And then my response would be, I don't know. I think we just need to focus on more consistency. And I get so frustrated at myself looking back at how I was responding in that situation. But another part of this podcast is looking at how it was impossible not to respond that way.
I think it might be helpful to explain what you mean when you say vile.
For example, a conversation about me trying to approach the topic of predictability and trying to build routine. I say to him, you love me, I love you. I just need to remember that we don't have to be anywhere by any particular time and just appreciate our journey. And then he responds with, what do you mean by limited predictability in our relationship? Just so you know, that expression there, the limited predictability, that is a statement of distrust. I am not unpredictable, such that I cannot be trusted. And so he goes on. And I say, the more I think about this, the more I think this is a me problem. I don't want marriage. I don't want kids. I don't want to cohabitate. And he responds with, you have a very strong desire to be fucking annihilated, fucking again, hit, hurt, etc. When you are constantly distrusting me, you are pulling that out of me. And you are admitting that really at the end of the day, the only thing that can shut you up is a detached cock that is big enough to destroy your torn pussy. And my response to that is, okay, I don't know. I think I'd just like to know days I get to see you.
I'm so sorry, Jess. Uh, that's a lot to listen to. I can't even imagine what that felt like to receive. And it sounds like you didn't even flinch.
No, it was just the normal at that point. It was what I should expect for asking for anything. There was another moment. I recall early on in our relationship, he had seen some videos of me playing music that my mum had very embarrassingly shared with him. And he had been at me to share a copy of these videos with him. And so I eventually conceded. And in a sweet moment, I sent him one of the videos of this song that I'd written when I was like 23, a long, long time ago. At first, he responded with such adoration. He'd sent me like a reaction video with his face in the corner, and he was in tears listening to this song that I had written. And it very quickly turned into, who did you write that song for? And I had said, well, no one. It's just a love song that I'd written when I was 23. But I said, it's kind of how I feel about you. And it was a very sweet song. It was about complete adoration for someone. It just spiraled. He then started reprimanding me because I was lying to him and gifting him a song that I had given to someone else. And not just given to someone else, but given to a white man with a big dick, and a white man that was my type and he wasn't my type. And so a really beautiful moment turned into just this complete implosion. He was forcing me to explain myself, and why I didn't inherently accept him and why I was like this. And I explained, I was digging deep. I was trying to figure out why. And this argument went on for days. I think it was a solid 3 days that we were going around in these circles. And so I think we hit a point where we got to my childhood and to my father. And I thought in the moment, that's the answer. I've hit it. It's childhood trauma from my father. That's why I'm like this. I truly believed at this point that I was like this. There was something in me that would do this. And so I had landed on this, okay, well, we figured it out together now. We can move on because I know what the cause is. And, I told him about my father, and then he just lost his absolute shit at me. I was not coping. And this had gone on for 3 days. I was trying to show up at work. And I recall going outside and, he was threatening me saying, I'm going to block you from everything. I'm not talking to you anymore. I'm going to leave the country. And so I felt like it was my fault that, I'd caused this. He wanted to uproot himself and leave the country, and his children would then not have a father, and it would be my fault. And so it was just gold class bonkers. He threatened suicide. He told me I'd killed him. And then he would just cut me off and tell me never to speak to him again. And then the next minute, he'd be trying to contact me, and then there'd be abuse because I wasn't picking up the phone. He was calling me a coward. You're such a coward. Pick up your phone, answer me, talk to me. I hit a point of complete collapse. And I didn't want to go home because you could see it. I had no option but to go elsewhere. And so I called Mel and I asked her if I could come to her house.
You've mentioned a couple of times that you were going through all of this and still showing up in your day to day. And the interesting overlay of this is that you were really close to taking long service leave at this point. I don't even think you were a month away from it. And so it was almost like you were holding your breath to have no one notice how bad things really were. But the holding your breath, if anybody did notice in your 9 to 5, could easily have been attributed to just you moving closer and closer towards this big holiday. And it was kind of a perfect storm of, hiding in plain sight and everything contributing to the hiding place.
I started to get really worried about how I was showing up at work. And yeah, I had planned this holiday where I was going to be leaving the country for a month. So yeah, I was kind of looking forward to not having to have this cover when I walked into the office every day. But at the same time, I didn't want to leave the country. It was getting a lot. And, I am entirely grateful for the position I have and the people that I had around me at work. I had an incredible manager who was really understanding and was really safe. I recall you came with me to talk to her about some concerns, and we didn't talk to her about the details. We sort of just said, my partner was really unwell and I was going through some things, and I had so much space there to breathe. And, I take a lot of pride in my work. I was feeling a lot of pressure, and it was internally driven. As I said, I was part of a very supportive and understanding team. And it's just, I felt like I was letting work down. I was letting my family down or my friends down because I was staying in this relationship that they didn't want me to be in. And I was letting Danny down. All of these things compounded, and I just could not cope anymore. And, they say if you can't spot the crazy person on the bus, it must be you. So I felt like I was the common thread in letting all these people down. I felt like I was the problem. And I should have been so excited. Long service leave doesn't come around often. Trips to Europe don't come around often. I should have been in a position where I was starting to feel relieved and getting excited about this big adventure I was going on. But I couldn't even think about what was going to happen the next day, let alone a few weeks ahead.
So is what you're saying that in all of these areas, you were the consistent thread and you were feeling like if you were the problem in all of these different situations, then it was just reaffirming everything that Danny was saying to you, that you were the problem, that you were the tyrant.
Yeah, there was nothing I could do to fix it. I was constantly trying to move on and get past it, and I couldn't do anything to fix it.
Mel shared with me her reflections of this evening and what it felt like to see her oldest friend in what can only be described as a state of despair. Mel, your experience of Danny was quite different to anybody else's in that he started communicating quite frequently and directly with you. How often was that happening? Did that start after the initial meeting or did that come in later?
It kind of came in later, and there was an episode that I'm for certain we'll talk about shortly that occurred between Jess and Danny where I had intervened on the telephone. And then that kind of opened the door because Jess had reached out further on down the line for some advice, not that much further, and said, would you be okay if he was to text you directly? And I said, look, if there's any way I can help with your relationship dynamic, sure. And then there were phone calls that would be hours long. He even gave me some advice. And I think maybe in the first instance, maybe that was even it, how it started off as him trying to help me see through some of the problems because I've been going through IVF. I had a miscarriage. It's been really testing and trying on my marriage. We're fine and we're stronger than ever. And I think Danny was just trying to help me understand how that's quite natural and normal. Very quickly from there, it became about the dynamic between him and Jess. And he would use me as a way, I think, originally I thought it was like a sounding board to better understand Jess. And I always put it down to language differences and the way cultural differences and how there's a misunderstanding. And because I know that so innately, I was more than happy to try to decodify Jess so that Danny could better understand her. Because it's if these problems that they're having can be solved through what was merely how I saw it at the time to begin with, miscommunication, well then she can find peace and harmony in a relationship and they can move past these continual dramas that kept popping up. But it evolved from what seemed to be a good conversation into what seemed like to me him trying to manipulate the narrative, but me being all too aware of what was happening because I didn't ever want to be the person that he said, Jess, you can't be around Mel anymore. I always wanted to be kind of the diplomat in this relationship. I never wanted Jess to be isolated, and I wanted him to think that I wasn't not on his side, if that makes sense.
Where did that instinct come from? What about him made you think that getting him offside might actually be a barrier to you being able to, welfare check Jess or stay as a safe person for her?
I think part of it is historical with our relationship Jess and I have had in the past with friendships and how I've seen people try to take over Jess's life and how I was kind of excluded early on because I didn't particularly like that person. So I want to make certain that I'm seen as not threatening at all, that I have no real judgments. I mean, of course I have judgments, but that I'm still always ultimately rooting. I want to make certain that whatever happens in this relationship, and even obviously at the beginning when I first met him, I didn't know this. This came after an event. I wanted just to make certain that whatever happened in Jess's life, I was always going to be allowed to be part of that relationship dynamic so that Jess would never be isolated. My fear was that he was going to isolate her, cut everyone out of her life, and then really inflict the trauma that, well, even to this day, I can't even believe that he's done.
So I think that's a beautiful way to move into the next part of this conversation. Just as a quick aside before we get there, so you've met, you've had that initial reaction to who he was and that initial encounter. Did you hear much about him or were you talking much with Jess between that point and that critical night?
Words have been spoken, conversations had been had. But did I realize it was bad as it was when it happened on that night? No. I knew there was something amiss, but then every relationship has teething problems. Like I mentioned before, when two people get together, you've got two different personalities that have histories and you're trying to find a way forward. And when I was talking to Jess up until this point, I almost in a way kept kind of qualifying his actions by saying, yeah, but in my relationship, blah, 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 blah. And so there was still that benefit of the doubt. I didn't see him yet as the threat that I realized he was to be. once this incident occurred.
And I think that that is a really natural thing as well. So you're talking through the context of being in a committed relationship as well. And so you're quantifying conversations you're having with Jess through that lens. You can't possibly know what the inside of anyone's relationship is unless you're one of the two people who are in that relationship. But I do want to move to talking about that night. So you have this perception of who Danni is, these normal challenges being faced. Obviously, you have an awareness of this other overlay. Maybe it's cancer, maybe it's something else. And then you get a message from Jess. Can you talk to me a little bit about your memory of that day?
It was, for lack of a better word, a normal day. And I get this message sometime in the afternoon around 3:30, 4 o'clock, just as the day was ticking off. And yeah, I received this message from Jess and it was strange. And I think she said something like, it's over, it's done. And I'm like, what do you mean it's done? What's done? Is it something to do with work? Is it what's going on? And Jess basically said that Danni had just been, in a way, berating her, and she's done, she's exhausted, and he's ended it, and it's done. And I was like, wait, what? Hang on, I don't understand, because up until this point, I wasn't really privy to what had been happening behind the scenes. So once again, everything was through the lens of a normal contextualized relationship. But I could hear it in Jess's, like, how can you hear a text message? But I could just sense it was weird, it was off. And then she sends me a picture of her, and I was worried. I looked at her, and the person staring back at me, I could tell something was really, really wrong. So I texted her straight away. I said, can I call you? She's like, look, I'm just finishing up at work, but can I come over? And I was like, of course. She goes, I'll call you when I'm in my car. About an hour or two had gone past, so I was worried. I was like, where are you? She's like, oh, I'm stuck in traffic. And I was like, please just send me your location. I just want to know where you are. I'd known that in the past, Jess has had a panic attack driving in her car from a work incident many, many, many years ago. And I know that when she drives through tunnels, it used to really freak her out. And I was thinking where she was coming from work to get to my place, she might go through a tunnel. So I was like, well, at least if I know where she is, not like I could do anything, or if I could call and talk to her, at least I can know she's okay. You know, it's a silly way of making myself feel better when my poor friend is distressed. But I didn't know what really had happened, except for the relationship had broken down between her and Danni. Jess arrives at my house. She walks to the gate, goes up the stairs, and I'm there to meet her because obviously I was worried. And the sight of her, it nearly broke me. And it wasn't my Jess. And I'm getting a bit emotional thinking about it now, actually. And she, oh gosh.
Had you ever seen her like that before?
No, not like this. And not over a man. She collapsed in my arms and she broke down crying, and my heart broke because I knew something bad must have happened. And I'm like, what's happened? Like, tell me what's happened. And she couldn't get the words out. She was just barely getting air in her lungs. So I kind of carried her into my house and we sat down. And I was like, let me get you some water. And I was just more than focused on trying to get her breathing back to normal. And I was like, okay, get her breathing back to normal. Let's get her some water. Let's get her to try to calm down. And then I can find out what's happened. Before I even got a chance to truly understand what's happened, her phone started blowing up. It wouldn't stop ringing. And every time that phone rang, the way her body convulsed, it made me, I'm like, what is happening? And I looked and I saw it was Danni calling. And she's like, oh, I can't. I was like, don't leave it. Don't answer it. Leave it. Just, we need to calm you down. And I was like, I almost tried to grab the phone off her to put it in a different room. But it was funny. She was kind of like holding on to it, but also wanting me to take it. It was this weird kind of fight that was going on, so to speak. Anyway, I was like, okay, I'll ignore that. Let me just keep focusing on her. So I was trying to get her like, what's happened? Talk to me. What's happened? Couple of words came out. All I could really understand was not much more than what I got from that text message. Their relationship's over. He's broken her. And I could see it. He did. He broke her. But the phone just kept ringing and ringing. And I swear to God, I wanted to grab that thing and throw it so far out of the house just to get a moment of silence so that I could get her to come to a place where we could talk through it. So she was like, no, I just need to answer it. I just need to answer it. So she answered it. And then on the other end, I could hear him wailing, screaming, yelling, all bunch of things. And I'm like watching Jess, and that you could just see it taking over her and the way she was viscerally responding to the diatribe that was on the other side of the phone. And I was like, I need to get involved with this.
Could you hear any of what he was saying?
I can't remember now. And my memory isn't as good as I would love it to be. I can't remember the exact words, but I remember the tone, the sound, and the feeling it made me. Like, I wanted to run. I wanted to hide from it. And he wasn't my partner.
So you had that instinct, you wanted to grab the phone. Did she let you?
She did. So when I took the phone, this is what I do remember. Oh, Jessie, no, what are you doing to me? Oh. And it sounds so melodramatic, but it was something out of a scene of like a really bad telenovela. I don't know if you've ever seen the really bad Latin American drama romance shows, kind of like Bold and the Beautiful. It was over the top, but you could hear him. And I just said, hey, Danni, it's Mel. You need to calm down. This is not helpful or healthy for both of you. Jess needs time, and it sounds like you need time too. So can you please stop calling and take a breath, go calm down so that you can both have some time to think, and then you have a chance to talk. But right now, this isn't helpful for anyone.
Did you notice a shift once he knew it was you on the other end, or that you were there?
Thinking back on it, there was definitely a change. It went from almost like an aggressive wailing and like, oh, I'm now the victim versus I'm the aggressor, if that makes sense. It was strange to hear that pitch change and how it softened off, but it was still like he was sobbing and he's like, oh, I've stuffed it up. It's my fault. It's my fault. I'm the worst. It's my fault. And I was like, hey, Danni, look, it doesn't matter whose fault it is. You're both hurting and this is not productive. I need you to hang up the phone. Then I will hang up the phone and you need to go calm down. She needs to calm down. This is not a safe space for either of you. And then I said, I'm hanging up the phone, and I could hear him saying other things, but I'm sorry, he's not my concern, because I could see what effect this whole interaction was having on her, and she was getting worse, not better.
So this is an incredibly strange, distressing thing. Out of nowhere, what was your reaction to hearing all of that on top of an incredibly stressful afternoon, wondering what on earth had happened? Where was your head at?
What did he do to her? I will disclose, I was sexually assaulted many years ago. And so in that moment, I could recognize in her the same level of panic that I had after I was assaulted. So my brain naturally went to, has he assaulted her? Has something like happened? That's not to diminish emotional and verbal assault from sexual, physical assault. There is no difference. Well, there is, but there isn't in my mind. It's still panic inducing, and it still brings up these convulsions in your body that you have no control of. So my concern was purely, how do I help her? Because I'm now recognizing symptoms that I myself had experienced. So my first and only concern was, how do I make this environment for her to feel safe? But in saying that, I also know that you need to allow yourself to feel what you're feeling in that moment, because if you don't get it out, it will manifest and bottle up in other ways. So I wanted her to know she was safe, but it's okay to cry. It's okay to shake because you're safe. And I think I even said to her, you're safe here. And I remember just rubbing her back and holding her and saying, it's okay, get it out. Do whatever you need in this moment. And she did.
So this is the moment when Jess brings you in on the fact that Danni had been abusing her. What happened after the phone call ended?
It all came out. This relationship that I thought was a budding, blooming, beautiful thing had been laced with arsenic. It was difficult to hear because she is my person. How dare he? The reality is it was a juxtaposition of this desire and need to want to protect her versus trying to soothe and be there for her. And when she was there for me during my darkest moments. So I knew that she just needed space and time to be able to allow herself to tell me what it is she needed to tell me. And also letting her know that she didn't have to tell me everything, but just letting her know that she could stay here the night. You're safe here. Can I get you food? Like, I was just trying to calm her nervous system so that she could have some semblance of calm before she felt comfortable enough to start opening up and telling me all the horrid things that had been happening in her life.
So you're at a critical point here. So this is the first moment when she's starting to bring you in on what had actually been going on for her. But you also know you need to be able to stick around so that you can continue to support her, even if it's quietly. How did you approach having a conversation where she gave you enough information to tell you what had led to this moment, but also not sever a tie?
It's a really good question. And to be honest, I don't really know how it is that I did it. I'm not a trained professional. I've lived life. I've had shitty things happen to me. Jess has been there to support me through it. So all I knew is that we have enough years and enough shit up our belt. She knows in the heart of heart that there's nothing I'm going to say that is going to be judgmental. But how do you have this conversation? How do you make someone feel comfortable enough to open up, even when you have a lifetime of history together, when you can visibly see that they are so distressed? I don't really know what I said, but obviously whatever I did say was enough for her to feel comfortable enough to speak to me. And the only thing I can guess is that I would have said something to the effect of like, I'm not judging you, Jess. Tell me what you want to tell me. Don't tell me what you don't want to tell me. All I care about is you and your well-being.
So I'm curious, what actually happened?
What I didn't realize up until this point was that the relationship problems they were experiencing weren't the normal run-of-the-mill problems. There's always teething problems in relationships, but this went beyond the pale. There was, from what I can remember at that time, there was patterns of verbal abuse. There was sleep deprivation. There was this all-night interrogation of her sexual past, who she'd been with. It's like he was fundamentally picking every single part of her that we all love and finding ways to find fault in it and breaking her down piece by piece. And there she was, this light of my life, in absolute pieces. He was doing a bloody good job of breaking my friend. And I didn't realize how much he had hurt her and how much he had worn her down.
Yeah, there's a difference between, oh, please stop leaving your dirty socks on the floor, or I am going to, and every sexual partner that you've had before me is an insult to me, and you are now my terrorist because you dared to have a sexual thought before I came into your life, kind of thing, right? So I guess what I'm curious to know, I want to understand how you approach what happened next, because obviously this is an evening that reframed a lot of what you thought you understood about Jess's relationship. How did you start to express to her that you were concerned for her, that what was happening with Danni was terrible, cancer, hard, mental illness, difficult? How did you start to reframe your dynamic with Jess to let her know that there were people who cared about her and what she was going through?
I think in the first instance, I just let her talk and just say whatever she needed to say. And I made a point of not casting any judgment, saying, why did you do that? Why did you put up with that? Because I'm not here to judge anyone's actions in the heat of the moment. We all react differently, and so that's not my place. My place was to be a safe space where she could say anything to me and that I would just be there to listen. As the conversation went on, she started to calm down and I was able to pull out more and more information about what was happening. I just said to her, look, Jessica, relationships are hard and it doesn't sound like you have a healthy dynamic. And maybe you guys need to get assistance. She said, well, kind of already been doing that. So I really didn't want to say too much at that point in time. I was more focused on trying to deal with the situation at hand. I think it's more the conversations that happen afterwards. But one thing I was very clear on after that I need to play this in a very particular light with Danni to make certain that he does not exclude me from her life. So every message I sent to Jess was always measured. I always said, I'm rooting for you guys, even though I wasn't.
But were you scared for her?
I was terrified. There is my friend who has worked with, in child protection and refugee camps on the middle of an island in the middle of nowhere, who has got brothers and sisters and is one of the strongest people I know. And she was a shaking leaf in my arms. She was broken. Of course I was terrified for her because he did that to her.
Jess, how does it feel hearing Mel describe your state of mind here?
I was not okay at that point. I knew at the time I wasn't okay. I had once again exposed this part of our relationship to someone else. During this particular argument, he had ended our relationship. And so I was terrified that I was going to lose him still. And so, whilst, someone else had seen this complete insanity that was going on in my life, I still didn't want to lose him. And I was going to do anything I could to get back on track, I suppose.
Do you think it's that you didn't want to lose him, or that you were so wrapped up in you and him that losing him also meant you disappearing entirely too at that point?
I think that's a perfect way of saying it. My life had become Danni. My life had become this cycle with Danni. I don't think I could recognize who I was before Danni at that point. So, yeah, I think it would have been a huge shock to the system to have to find my way back to whatever I was before I met him. I remember after this, I think for him, having Mel experience that moment, that shocked him back into trying to be the sweet, loving partner that he presented himself to be initially. And so we got back on track with this, trying to set this predictability in our relationship. And it came to a point where it was like, okay, well, predictability for us apparently meant meeting people in our lives. So we arranged dinner with his best friend. And I was really anxious about this particular meeting because his best friend's wife was actually the best friend of his ex-wife. Knowing how I was presenting in my everyday life and showing up to work, I didn't want them to get the wrong impression about me in any way, thinking that whatever they observed would get fed back to his ex-wife. And so, they'd all gone to uni together, and while I was stoked, I was thrilled to be meeting additional people in his life who loved him and knew him well. I was so nervous about this one. We went to the dinner and it went really well. Again, they were beautiful people and they seemed to care about him a lot. I recall when we showed up, his friend gave him a hug and he just did not let go of him. I swear it lasted for about 5 minutes, this hug. It was just so obvious that there was this version of Danni that I had seen that other people knew, and these people had known him for a long time. So again, I was validated going, okay, well, maybe this is a blip. Maybe this is a moment in Danny's life where he's struggling. The dinner was beautiful. They were lovely people. We all got along. And, I was on this high because we'd had this really nice evening after months of volatility. It just felt so calm and it felt like we were so close again. After the dinner, we had agreed to go to a hotel. Danny had to go be with his children the next day and it was halfway between our homes. But we had driven separate cars to get to the dinner. So we left their friend's house and I arrived at the hotel and Danny arrived much later than I did. And then when he arrived, he was on the phone for about 45 minutes. It was getting late and I was really frustrated because all I wanted to do was spend time with him and debrief about this dinner that I was really nervous about. And then the longer he stayed on this phone call, the more frustrated I got. And then I got to a point where I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't cause an argument. So I just sat there and I didn't say anything. Danny was trying to ask me what was wrong. And I just got increasingly frustrated. I can feel the feeling now. I just kind of imploded into myself. I remember he was asking if he could touch me and I couldn't find the words to express myself. I think by this point I had become so nervous about saying the wrong thing, but at the same time I'm a human being and I have feelings. So I'm feeling these feelings but not knowing how to express them. He started suggesting things that I was feeling about him. He started taking notes on his phone. And I eventually just snapped and I said, "Why is it that you get to have all of these problems? And the one time that I am imperfect or the one time that I feel upset, I am the worst person in the world." And when I said that, he lost it. It was the rage all over again. He started throwing himself around the room like nothing you've seen. He was hitting himself in the head extremely hard. He was screaming at me. And I recall jumping up of the bed and I was trying really hard to calm him down. We were in a hotel and I didn't want anyone to hear. I didn't want to cause a scene. So I was attempting to calm him down and I placed myself between him and the door. And I was telling him that I was sorry and that it was okay. And I was begging him just to calm down. And then he got his phone out and he started filming me and started screaming at me that I was keeping him hostage and wouldn't let him leave the room. And I remember he picked up the hotel phone and dialed 000. And I just panicked. I didn't know what to do. So I eventually moved out of the way. He hung up the phone and he stormed out of the room. I was left alone and the air had not cleared. I was sitting in this terror that he was in this dissociative state. He was potentially driving, and I felt again responsible for causing it. I felt confused at how me being upset about something he had done ended up in another explosive outburst. I barely had said a word to him that night, and there we were, right back at violence and abuse. I immediately tried to contact him, and I'll admit I was terrified that he would be hurt out there in this state, and that would be my fault. He was driving. Could he have an accident? Could he hurt someone else?
And what happened next?
He sent me a very long text telling me that I was abusive and I was violent towards him and that he will not tolerate my abuse anymore. And I took responsibility for it immediately. I just wanted him to come back and be safe. I tried to go over the night and I listed all the things that I had done that might have been abusive. I gave him the silent treatment, so that must have been abusive. He started listing things that I thought was wrong with him and I didn't refute them, so that must have been abusive. When he flipped out and started violently raging, I tried to stop him from leaving the room. That was abusive. He told me I had misremembered what had happened and that I had been tearing him apart. He told me I was a classic abuser and he told me I was a tyrant again. He told me that my friends knew I was abusive and stopped me before I would go too far.
Oh, fuck no, Danny. That makes me really fucking mad, honestly. And this is me taking a moment just to reflect as someone who knows you incredibly well, because he knows exactly how highly you regard your friends and the weight that their opinions hold for you. And to think that he would actually try to manipulate those relationships as a tool in his game of systematically destroying your sense of self is just beyond something I can comprehend.
Yeah. He started comparing me to his abusive brother, and I agreed with him at this point, and I told him it has to be over between us because I'm so harmful to him. He told me I would never contact him again, and if I did, he would get a domestic violence order against me and contact the police. And he kept going. I told him he was right and that I was the monster and that he needs to stay away from me, but he kept going. I told him I would leave the hotel and that he could stay there so he didn't have to drive all the way home in that state. I told him to calm down and that we were done and that he was safe. But he kept going.
Did it ever occur to you at this point, when you are so worried about him and driving in the state that he's in, what it might have meant for you to be driving in that state? You've offered to leave the hotel room. You have offered to make this space available to him, but you've also said that you were halfway between your home and his. It would have been a long drive for you to get somewhere else that was safe. Did it ever occur to you how unsafe it would have been, given the state that you were in, to get in a car and drive anywhere?
No, I didn't think that. I didn't think about the fact that I was in the same position that he was in. I didn't think about it being unsafe for me to get behind the wheel of a car. I was only thinking about Danny and his state. It was like I didn't matter at all. I just wanted it to be over. I didn't want to ever be the cause of that kind of violent outburst again. I could see it was hurting him and I realized the consequences were serious if he ever did anything more. It became this battle within his own head. He couldn't reconcile what he believed to have happened with what had actually happened. And he eventually told me the only way he could stop it was to kill himself. He was driving, he was in extreme distress, and now he was going to take his own life. And I was helpless. I was sitting in the hotel room trying to think what I could possibly do.
And you have shared that this wasn't the only night like this. In fact, there were a number like this afterwards. And that later on down the track, you actually had the instinct to film some of them. And that makes a lot of sense given the absurdity of the reaction.
I ended up recording some moments, not for any other reason, but because they felt so surreal. I thought I was going crazy, but at the same time, I could recognize what was happening intellectually. And so, yeah, I would record them. The version of me talking about this now would have picked up the phone and called the police and told them he was on the road and a danger to himself and other motorists. But that version of me sitting in the room at that time just wanted to contain it, to make it all go away, to reverse the clock and have a loving night with my boyfriend in a nice hotel. But despite all my attempts to set him free, to tell him he was right, that I was wrong, and that it was a good decision that we ended, he just kept going. And then I cracked. Not violently, but something in my head snapped. And I just wanted to disappear into nothingness. I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I was done. I was entirely empty inside, entirely worn down into this absolute nothingness. And I told him I was done with living. I felt like that was my answer for peace. And so I stood there and I looked out the window over this beautiful city that I grew up in and I loved. I was grateful for all the beautiful times I had in my life. And he was panicking at this point. I think he realized that I'd let go. And he suddenly snapped back into reality, but it didn't matter to me anymore. I started preparing myself. I could jump in the river. It wasn't far away. I could slit my wrists. It was just a series of steps that I just had to follow. And so I sat down on the bed and I looked up my life insurance policy to see if it would pay out if I took my own life. And there it was in black and white. That death cover policy that saved my life. It said, we can't pay your insurance claim if it's caused directly or indirectly by certain things, including war, criminal activity, or deliberately hurting yourself. And I couldn't leave my family with nothing. And so I was trapped. I sat there on the bed with a knife in my hand from this hotel kitchenette, and I couldn't do anything about it. I was this special kind of addicted, the kind where being without him was just as unbearable as being with him.
Next time on Beyond Curious, we explore what happens when the chaos doesn't stop, it just changes time zones. And apparently, time differences don't apply to delusion or to someone determined to be the centre of every story, no matter the distance.